The transmission came in at 3:14 hours, and Ambassador Sierra Vance was already awake. She had not slept in 2 days, not because she was tired, not because anything was wrong. She was awake because tonight was the night the Vreth Empire planned to introduce a new military resolution at the Galactic Concord, and she needed to make sure it failed quietly, without anyone noticing that she had made it fail. Sierra stood by the tall observation window of her quarters aboard Confluence Station. Below her, or what passed for below in zero gravity, the station hummed with activity. Thousands of species moved through its corridors at all hours. Traders, diplomats, scientists, spies dressed as all three. The station was considered neutral ground. Every great civilization in the known galaxy had a seat here. Every empire, every dominion, every federation. Including humanity. Humanity had held its seat at the Concord for 61 years. In that time, humans had become known for three things. They were reliable trade partners, they were enthusiastic learners, and they were absolutely, completely, almost embarrassingly harmless. That reputation had taken a great deal of effort to build. Sierra touched the encrypted terminal on her desk and opened the morning briefing. The Vreth resolution was called Resolution 479, and it proposed mandatory arms disclosure for all Concord member species. Every hull, every weapon system, every shipyard. Full transparency. It was framed as a peace measure. Everyone in the room would know it was a tracking measure. The Vreth wanted to know exactly who had what and exactly where it was. If that resolution passed, the plan would be over. Sierra closed the briefing, changed into her formal diplomatic uniform, and went to work. The Concord Assembly Hall was a vast, cathedral-like space designed to accommodate beings of 20 different physical forms. There were platforms for those who breathed nitrogen, sealed booths for species sensitive to light, temperature zones separated by invisible atmospheric barriers. Sierra walked to the human delegation platform, nodded to her two junior attachés, and sat down. Across the floor, the Vreth representative, a towering creature called HFY Sto, was already speaking. The Vreth were impressive. 12 feet tall, 4 arms, skin like hammered copper. Their empire stretched across 11 star systems, and they had been the dominant military power in this region of the galaxy for 300 years. They found humans amusing. That was the word they used, amusing. HFY Sto was explaining the resolution in smooth, practiced tones. Transparency builds trust. Trust builds peace. Every species benefits. The chamber murmured with interest. Sierra waited. When it was her turn to speak, she walked to the central address point, adjusted the translation collar at her throat, and smiled at the assembly the way a person smiles when they are very slightly confused about something. "We appreciate the spirit of this proposal," she said. "We really do. And as always, humanity is committed to peace and cooperation. We simply have some concerns about the technical language in Subclause 19. It seems to imply that civilian orbital platforms would fall under the disclosure requirement. We would like to request a working group to examine the language before we move to a vote." HFY Sto stared at her. The Vreth always found it difficult to tell whether humans were being deliberately slow or genuinely slow. That ambiguity was one of humanity's greatest diplomatic assets. "A working group," Sto repeated. "Yes, just to clarify the language. It should only take a few months." It took 8 months. By the time the working group concluded, 3 other species had raised separate concerns about Subclause 12, and the resolution died in committee. Sierra filed her report to Earth that evening. 3 words, bought more time. The reply came back 6 hours later. The reply was also 3 words, good, keep going. She sat alone in her quarters that night, watching the stars through the observation window. Somewhere behind those stars, in the upper atmospheres of 6 gas giants in human space, thousands of workers were living their carefully classified lives, building things that had no name on any public manifest. She had seen the numbers once 18 months ago, just the numbers, not the ships themselves, and even the numbers had made her hands shake. She poured herself a glass of water, sat back, and thought about a small colony called Veth Minor. Most humans alive today had never heard of Veth Minor. It was a fringe settlement, 30,000 people, mostly miners and their families, on a planet at the very edge of human-claimed space. 31 years ago, the Vreth Empire had been conducting what they called a routine weapons test in a nearby uninhabited system. Something went wrong with the targeting parameters, or so they said. The yield reached Veth Minor's atmosphere. The Concord investigation concluded it was an accident. The Vreth issued a formal apology. They paid reparations. The case was closed. Humanity said thank you, accepted the reparations, and went very quiet. That quiet had lasted 31 years. Sierra took a slow sip of water. Out the window, a Vreth diplomatic cruiser was docking at the far end of the station. Sleek, powerful, bristling with sensor arrays and weapon ports that it was not required to conceal because the Vreth had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Not yet. She set down her glass and opened the next day's schedule. There was a trade negotiation at 9, a cultural exchange dinner at 1400, and a closed-session inquiry about human shipping routes at 1600. The inquiry had been requested by a call intelligence analyst named Tess Voren. It was the fourth such inquiry he had filed in 2 years. He was getting closer. She had read his reports. He was extraordinarily good at his job. She made a note to be especially charming at 1600. The weeks passed the way they always passed on Confluence Station, busy and slow at the same time. Sierra attended 46 committee sessions over the following 3 months. She raised concerns, requested clarifications, complimented delegates on their species' cultural achievements, and steered 11 separate military proposals gently into the soft ground of extended review. She developed a reputation among the alien delegations as a diplomat who was always willing to talk, never in a hurry, and slightly less sharp than she looked. She was considered harmless. That was the word they always came back to, harmless. She had heard it applied to humanity so many times that she had stopped reacting to it. The Vreth used it. The Call used it. The Orth Federation's ambassador once described humanity at a public reception as the galaxy's most enthusiastic children. The room had laughed. Sierra had laughed too. She was very good at laughing at exactly the right moment. One evening, she received a message from her older brother, Carter Vance, who worked as an engineer on a deep space construction platform. His messages were always cheerful and vague. He talked about the weather, which was meaningless in space, and about his colleagues, whose names she did not recognize, and about the long shifts and the good food and how much he missed sunlight. He never talked about what he was building. Neither did she. That was the agreement. That had always been the agreement. The people who knew kept quiet. The people who did not know did not need to. And the galaxy, which was watching humanity with the comfortable confidence of those who believed they had already assessed the situation correctly, kept watching the surface and never thought to look deeper. Sierra finished reading her brother's message, smiled, and went to bed. Outside the window, the stars held their silence. And deep inside 6 gas giants, the silence held its own. There was a moment, 3 years into her posting, when Sierra thought the whole thing might come apart. It was not because of anything the aliens had discovered. It was because of something she saw on a routine data transfer from Earth. The number of completed hulls had crossed 100. She read the figure twice, put down the terminal, and walked to the bathroom. She ran cold water over her wrists, the way her mother had taught her to do when she felt overwhelmed, and stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. 100 planetary siege platforms. Not warships, not battle cruisers, planetary siege platforms. The distinction was important. A warship fights other ships. A siege platform does something else entirely. The specifications she had been cleared to review described weapons systems capable of disrupting a planet's electromagnetic field fracturing tectonic plates and stripping an atmosphere in stages. They were not designed to be used. They were designed to be seen, and once seen, to never need to be used. That was the theory. Sierra dried her hands, walked back to her desk, and returned to work. She never mentioned the number to anyone. She never mentioned the moment in the bathroom, either. She filed it away in the same internal cabinet where she kept everything else. The memory of Veth Minor, the sound of high-voiced desk calling humans amusing, the look on every alien diplomat's face when they assumed the human in the room was the least dangerous person present. She kept all of it, and she kept working, and the years moved forward. On the day she received the message that the Second Fleet was now half complete, she was sitting in a negotiation session about grain transport routes. She read the notification under the table, put her terminal away, and asked a very detailed question about cargo container specifications that kept the session running 40 minutes past schedule. It was, she would later write in her private journal, one of the better days. When Tess Voren of the Call Intelligence Division formally requested a private meeting with Ambassador Vance, Sierra agreed within the hour. She had been expecting it. Tess Voren was not like most of the analysts she dealt with. Most of them were thorough but predictable. They looked where they expected to find things. Tess Voren looked where things should not be. He was a small creature by Call standards, pale gray, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line across a narrow face. He wore civilian clothes and carried no visible recording equipment, which meant he was definitely recording everything. They met in a neutral conference room on level 7. Sierra brought tea. Tess Voren brought a data pad. "Ambassador Vance," he said, setting the pad on the table between them, "I appreciate your time." "Always," she said, and meant it in the way that people mean things they have practiced. "I want to discuss some gravitational anomalies we have detected near several gas giants in human-administered space." He slid the pad toward her. "These readings span the last 4 years. They are inconsistent with natural planetary processes and inconsistent with the mining operations humanity has registered at those locations." Sierra looked at the data. She let her eyes move across it at the right speed. Not too fast, which would suggest she understood it immediately. Not too slow, which would suggest she was stalling. "That is interesting," she said. "What do you think is causing it?" "We believe large structures are being assembled inside those atmospheres. Structures large enough to generate measurable gravitational variance." "Large structures," she repeated. "Like what?" Tess Voren looked at her steadily. "We are not certain yet." "I see." She picked up her tea. "I can raise this with our science ministry. They manage the deep atmosphere research programs. There may be an experimental platform we were not aware had reached that scale. You know how these projects grow," she smiled. "Budgets are approved in stages. Sometimes the scientists get carried away." Tess Voren looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally, "that may explain it." They both knew it did not explain it. After he left, Sierra sat alone in the conference room for 4 minutes. Then she filed an urgent notice to Earth. The reply came back in 2 hours. "Accelerate the timeline." She stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then she started making arrangements. The next 14 months were the most demanding of Sierra's career. She chaired 6 separate working groups simultaneously. She introduced a new human proposal for expanded scientific cooperation, which consumed enormous amounts of conquered attention and goodwill, and produced a very detailed agreement about telescope sharing that no one would ever use. She attended 112 social events. She memorized the names of delegates' children, their cultural anniversaries, their dietary restrictions, their favorite topics of conversation. She was, by every observable measure, the busiest and most engaged human diplomat in conquered history. She was also watching Tess Voren. He was getting better. His team had cross-referenced the gravitational data with shipping manifests and found a pattern in the gaps. Things going in, nothing coming out, not cargo, not waste, nothing. 6 gas giants consuming resources at extraordinary rates and producing no measurable output. She knew the day he understood what that meant. She could tell because he stopped filing new inquiry requests. A diplomat who stops asking questions has either given up or found the answer. Thesvoren had not given up. She sent a message to Earth that night. It contained 2 words, he knows. Earth's reply was 1 word, good. She did not sleep that night either. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, and thought about a conversation she had once had with her father when she was 16 years old and had just been approached by the program. Her father had been quiet for a long time after she told him. Then he had asked her one question. "Do you understand what you are agreeing to?" She had said yes. He had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who understood something she did not yet fully understand, and he had nodded. Good, he had said. The same word. She closed her eyes, and outside in the dark between the stars, humanity's patience continued its long, quiet work. The Khal Dominion War Council received Thesvoren's report on a Tuesday. His report was 47 pages long, exhaustively sourced, and written in the careful, almost reluctant tone of a person who wishes they were wrong. The cover page contained a single sentence. "I believe humanity has been constructing a fleet of planetary siege platforms for a minimum of 30 years, and I believe the fleet is now operational." The War Council read it twice. Then they began debating how to respond. They were still debating 4 days later when something happened that ended the debate entirely. Every human vessel in conquered space went dark. Not offline, not unresponsive, dark, as if someone had switched off every signal, every beacon, every identification transponder simultaneously. One moment, 412 registered human vessels were present on conquered sensors. The next moment, the sensors showed empty space where those vessels had been. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord convened in 11 minutes. That was a record. Sierra walked into the chamber looking exactly as she always looked. Calm, professional, slightly tired in the way that diplomats always look slightly tired. She took her seat and waited. The Concord speaker, a tall Orith named Velkas, called for an explanation. The Vreth representative was already on its feet. 12 alien delegations were speaking at once. The translation system struggled to keep up. Sierra waited. After 4 minutes and 17 seconds of controlled chaos, she raised her hand. The room went quiet, not because she had any authority to quiet it, but because something in the stillness of her gesture, the unhurried way she raised her hand, made every delegate in that room suddenly want to hear what she was about to say. "I have a statement from the Earth government," she said. She unfolded a single sheet of paper, actual paper. She had requested it specifically. There was something about paper that screens could not replicate, a weight, a permanence. She read it aloud. The statement was 11 sentences long. It was not a declaration of aggression. It was not a list of demands. It was an explanation. It began. Humanity has spent 31 years preparing to ensure that what happened at Veth Minor can never happen to us again. It ended, "We are not here to conquer. We are here to be taken seriously." In between those 2 sentences, it named a number. 649. The number of planetary siege platforms humanity had placed in 17 star systems across what the conquered had always casually assumed was the harmless, underdeveloped fringe of human space. The room did not explode into noise this time. The room was very, very quiet. Thesvoren, seated in the Khal observation gallery, looked at the paper in Sierra's hands and felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt something close to admiration. High-voiced Des of the Vreth Empire was the first to speak. The translation collar rendered the words flat and even, but Sierra had learned to read Vreth body language over years of observation, and what she saw in the set of Des's shoulders, and the angle of its head was something she had never seen from a Vreth before. She saw uncertainty. "This is a provocation," Des said. "No," Sira replied. "A provocation is something you do to start a conflict. This is something we did to prevent one. There is a difference, and we have had 31 years to think carefully about that difference. You cannot simply place siege platforms in systems adjacent to Vreth space without prior notification. We place them in human-administered space," Sira said. "Every platform is within our legal territorial boundary as defined by the Concord Charter. Subsection 4, Article 11. We reviewed it many times." Another long silence. The Orith speaker, Velkas, leaned forward. "Ambassador Vance, are you saying that humanity has maintained this program in secret for 3 decades, while simultaneously participating in this Concord as a member in good standing?" "Yes," Sira said. "And the resources required were significant, yes." "How?" Velkas asked. The question seemed genuine. "How did you do it without anyone knowing?" Sira looked at the room. All those faces, all those species, all those great civilizations that had looked at humanity for 60 years and seen something small and manageable and safe. "We were very patient," she said, "and you were very confident." No one had an answer for that. After the session concluded, Sira stood alone on the Concord's outer observation deck. The stars were the same stars they had always been. They did not care about resolutions or platforms or the careful architecture of 30 years of silence. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and thought about her brother Carter, somewhere out there in the dark, coming home now that his work was done. She thought about Thesvorin, who had come closer than anyone to seeing the truth, and who had been right about everything and arrived at his answer just slightly too late to change anything. She thought about Veth Minor. She always came back to Veth Minor. An accident, they had called it. She hoped they understood now that humanity had decided, 31 years ago, that accidents of that kind would never be affordable again. The next 6 months were the strangest of Sira's life. She did not expect them to be strange. She expected chaos. She expected confrontation, emergency sessions, perhaps something close to crisis. She had prepared for all of that. What she had not prepared for was the silence. The Galactic Concord did not dissolve. It did not declare war. It did not demand that humanity dismantle the fleet, because the Concord Charter contained no mechanism for demanding that a member state dismantle legally positioned defensive assets, and humanity's legal team had spent 12 years making absolutely certain that was the case. Instead, the Concord fell into a kind of stunned renegotiation of reality. Delegations that had previously viewed the human seat as a courtesy now requested urgent bilateral meetings with the human diplomatic corps. The meetings were polite. They were also very different in tone from any meeting Sira had attended in her previous 12 years on the station. People listened differently now. They had always been listening, of course. But there is a difference between listening to someone who you believe has nothing of consequence to say, and listening to someone who has just demonstrated that they have been thinking consequential thoughts for 3 decades without saying any of them out loud. The Vreth Empire requested a private session first. Sira attended with 2 junior attachés and a senior advisor named Oliver Crane, who had spent 20 years studying Vreth diplomatic protocol and had the patient energy of a man who had prepared for every possible outcome. They sat across from high-voiced Des and 3 members of the Vreth Military Council in a room that felt significantly smaller than it had before, though nothing about the room had changed. High-voiced Des began by saying that the Vreth Empire did not accept that the current situation constituted a legitimate response to the Veth Minor incident, which had been ruled an accident by the Concord's own independent investigators. Sira let the statement finish. Then she said, "We understand that was the ruling. We also understand that 30,000 people do not come back because a ruling was filed." Des was quiet for a moment. We paid reparations, Des said. Yes, Sierra said, you did. Another silence. Oliver Crane, seated beside her, did not move or speak. He was very good at silences. Des said, what does humanity want? It was the question Sierra had been waiting 12 years to answer. She had practiced the answer many times. She had written it out in different forms, tested different framings, considered different tones. In the end, she had decided that the simplest version was the most honest. We want to be the kind of civilization that cannot be dismissed, she said. We want every war council in this galaxy to know that any action taken against a human life will be met with a response that cannot be ignored. We do not want to conquer anyone. We do not want reparations. We want the kind of peace that comes from being genuinely, measurably dangerous. That is the only kind of peace we have ever trusted. Des looked at her for a long time. You built 649 ships to make a point, Des said. We built 649 ships because 30,000 people died and the galaxy called it an accident and moved on, Sierra said. The ships are the point, yes, but they are also real. Both of those things are equally true. The Vreth Military Council members said nothing. Sierra had learned over the years to pay close attention to what military people did when they had no response. They got very still. They were very still now. The session ended with a joint communiqué that said very little while implying a great deal. The Vreth Empire, over the following 3 months, quietly withdrew from 2 border systems they had been contesting with a smaller species called the Arab Collective. They described this as a gesture of goodwill. No one asked them to explain the timing. The Khal Dominion requested a separate session 1 week after the Vreth meeting. This one was different. Thesvoren was there. He sat at the far end of the Khal delegation table, not in a position of authority, but not in the background either. He watched Sierra with those 4 horizontal eyes and said nothing while the Khal foreign minister spoke about the importance of transparency and the need to rebuild trust between species. When the formal portion of the session ended and the delegations were filing out, Thesvoren approached her. I was 11 days away, he said. Sierra looked at him. From what? From having enough evidence to trigger a full Concord investigation. If I had filed my final report 11 days earlier, you would have been compelled to respond to a formal inquiry before the disclosure was on your timeline. She thought about this. What would you have done with the report? Filed it, he said. That is my job. I know. He tilted his head slightly. It was a Khal gesture she had learned meant something between acknowledgement and curiosity. How did you know I was close? You stopped asking questions, she said. He made a sound that the translation collar rendered as something close to a laugh. I thought I was being subtle. You were very subtle, she said, and meant it. You were the best analyst I worked against in 12 years. If you had been given another month, I think you would have found everything. Thesvoren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The colony, Veth Minor. I read the original investigation files when I began looking into your program. The evidence of negligence in the Vreth weapons test was stronger than the ruling acknowledged. Sierra held his gaze. Yes. The Concord wanted the matter closed. Yes. Another silence. I am sorry, he said, for what it is worth from someone who had nothing to do with the decision. Sierra had not expected that. She had expected many things from this conversation, but not that. She stood with it for a moment before she responded. It is worth something, she said, more than you might think. Thesvoren nodded once, then he left. 3 weeks later, Sierra received a formal invitation from the Khal Intelligence Directorate to consider a joint cooperation framework on early warning systems. The invitation had been co-signed by Thesvoren. She forwarded it to Earth with a recommendation to accept. Earth said yes. The following months brought more meetings, more negotiations, more long sessions in rooms where the air had changed. The Concord restructured its Security Council. Humanity received a permanent seat with full veto authority over any resolution affecting human-administered space. The language had taken 6 weeks to finalize and had involved 7 separate legal teams. The Concord also established a new joint oversight committee for the platforms themselves. Humanity agreed to allow monitored inspections at fixed intervals, with human personnel present, under conditions that Earth had spent 4 years pre-negotiating before anyone outside the inner program knew the fleet existed. Even that had been planned. The Vreth High Command sent a second formal delegation to request a private technical briefing on the platform's capabilities. They framed it as a mutual transparency initiative. Sira attended the briefing personally. She sat across from 4 Vreth military commanders and walked them through a single demonstration recording. It was not of a living planet. It was of a dead moon, a small airless body in an uninhabited system that had been selected 18 months earlier for exactly this purpose. The recording lasted 40 seconds. The moon ceased to exist at the 11-second mark. The Vreth commanders watched the recording twice. Then they sat in complete silence for almost 3 minutes. One of them asked a technical question about the energy yield. Sira's senior technical advisor, a quiet woman named Helen Ford, answered it precisely. None of the Vreth commanders asked a second question. The meeting ended shortly after. On the way back to the human diplomatic section, Helen fell into step beside Sira and said, "Do you think they will test us?" "No," Sira said. "How can you be sure?" "Because they just watched the recording twice," Sira said. "The second time was not because they missed something. The second time was because they needed to accept what they had seen. People who are planning to test something do not need to accept it. They are still looking for the error." She paused. "They found no error." Helen nodded slowly. "Good," she said. That word again. Sira had heard it so many times now that it had taken on a kind of rhythm in her mind. Every decision, every plan that held, every session that ended the right way. Every year the program continued undetected, every hull completed, every piece of the long, patient architecture falling into place. Good. Her father had said it when she was 16. Earth had said it when Thesvoren came close. Helen said it now, walking down a corridor on Confluence Station, 2 years after the veil had dropped. She thought about all the people who had made the word true. The workers on the gas giant platforms, years away from sunlight, building things they would never publicly discuss. The engineers and physicists and legal teams who had spent careers on a project they could not put on their records. The diplomats who had played smaller, slower, less capable versions of themselves for decade after decade in rooms full of species who were happy to believe it. Carter had come home. She had finally visited him, 6 months after the disclosure. They had sat in their parents' garden, in actual sunlight, and talked for the first time without anything between them that could not be said. She had asked him what it was like. He had thought for a moment and said, "It felt like the most important thing I would ever do, every day, even the boring days, especially the boring days." She had understood exactly what he meant. Sira Vance retired from active diplomatic service 14 months after the Concord restructuring. She was offered 3 different senior positions within the new joint security framework. She turned all of them down politely and moved to a small house on a rebuilt colony world with a good garden and a window that looked out at a sky she had earned. She wrote her memoirs over 2 years. They were not published for another 10. The timing, as always, was considered carefully. In the final chapter, she wrote about the question she had been asked most often in the years since the disclosure. Not by alien delegations, by humans. The question was, were you ever afraid? She wrote about it honestly. Yes, she wrote, often. Not of the aliens, not of being discovered, not even of failure. She was afraid most deeply of the thing that had made the program necessary in the first place. The ease with which 30,000 lives had been categorized and processed and settled and set aside. The way an empire could call the end of a colony an accident and receive a formal apology in return and consider the matter concluded. She was afraid of living in a galaxy where that was simply how things worked. The program had not changed that part of the galaxy. She was honest about that too. There were still species with more power than conscience. There were still decisions made in distant rooms that affected people who were never consulted. What had changed was the calculation. No one in any war council in the known galaxy was now able to look at human space and weigh the cost of an accident the way they had been able to weigh it 31 years ago. The numbers were different. The equation was different. The moment any such council began moving pieces in a direction that pointed toward human lives, there was now a very clear and very measurable consequence waiting at the end of that direction. It was not love. She had never expected love. Humanity was not loved. But humanity was not dismissed. Humanity was not assumed. Humanity was not the afterthought at the end of an agenda, the species the great empires tolerated because it was convenient and posed no real concern. That had changed. She wrote, "I do not know if what we did was perfect. I know it was necessary. I know that 30,000 people on Veth Minor deserve to live in a galaxy that would have paused before treating their lives as an acceptable variable. I know we could not give them that. What we could do was make sure that the next colony, and the one after that, and every human settlement that would ever exist in the future, would live in a galaxy that paused. So we built the pause. It took 31 years and required more patience than I thought any group of people could maintain. It required a silence that was not easy and was not comfortable and was not without cost. The workers who spent their careers in gas giant platforms gave up sunlight and acknowledgement, and the simple right to tell the truth about what they had done with their lives. That is not a small thing. It should not be written about as though it was small. But they did it, every one of them, because they understood what the alternative looked like. And then she wrote the line that would be quoted most often, in the years that followed, whenever someone asked what humanity had learned from Veth Minor. She wrote, "They asked us why we said nothing for 31 years. I told them the truth. We were afraid once, and we decided, quietly and together, that we would never be afraid in that way again. We just had the patience to wait until the moment was ours to choose." The stars outside her window did not comment on this. They never did. They simply held their light and their silence and their vast, indifferent distance, the way they always had, the way they always would. Humanity had learned something from stars, in the end. Not from their light. From their patience.